The topic that I want to speak about briefly tonight is a topic that is at the very center of the Buddha Dhamma. This is the mind, what we call citta. The Buddha set out on a quest for a solution to the problem of suffering. And through his investigation, his deep contemplation, he found that the entire causal origination of suffering lies within the mind. And for the same reason, the entire path to liberation is a process of developing the mind. In the period before the arising of the Buddha, the dominant belief amongst the Indian ascetics was the belief that there is some kind of permanent core in the human being. This core is what is called the Atman, or self. And so the whole drive of Indian ascetic practice, Indian meditative practice, was to find the self within. And the self was conceived to be an entity which is without any kind of fixed characteristics, an entity which is permanent, unchanging, eternal, and at its deepest center, extensive with the whole universe. The Buddha's, through his enlightenment, we could say, knocked the self out of the center of the picture of the spiritual quest. And by knocking the self out of the center of the picture, what comes into view as the central object of concern is not an entity which is permanent, unchanging, and without fixed characteristics, but rather the mind itself, the mind which is always individual to each of us, which is always changing, and which displays quite distinctive characteristics. And what the Buddha did with his panya, his wisdom, was to investigate into the nature of the mind, and to find that despite all of the diversity in the mind, all its variety, all of its multiplicity, states of mind can basically be distinguished into two fundamental types or categories. These two categories into which the Buddha classified the mind are fundamental to the entire project of finding happiness, even at the mundane level, and achieving ultimate liberation, the world-transcending liberation. So what are these two characteristics, or these two categories into which the Buddha divided the mind? In Pali, he uses the words akusala and kusala. Akusala means, or can be translated, unwholesome, unskillful, detrimental. And the opposite, kusala, is the mind that is wholesome, that is skillful, healthy, or beneficial. And so, when we set out to practice the Buddha Dhamma, to study the Buddha Dhamma, to dedicate our life to following the Buddha's path, the most essential task, we can say, is to understand these two basic tendencies of the mind. To understand that our states of mind, which might be occurring momentarily, which might be arising and passing very quickly, which might often escape our understanding, are still often stamped with these two tendencies, the unwholesome tendency and the wholesome tendency. And when we can understand how the mind falls into these two classes, or tends in these two directions, then we can see that the task of the Buddha's spiritual life is to step by step in a systematic way supplant the unwholesome states of mind with wholesome states of mind. To remove the unwholesome states of mind. Let us say first to weaken the tendencies to unwholesome states of mind, to strengthen the tendencies to the wholesome states of mind, and eventually to eliminate completely even the subtlest tendencies to the unwholesome mind, and to perfect and fulfill the wholesome qualities of the mind. We find this distinction between the two types of mind running throughout the whole teaching of the Buddha. Even if probably most of you are familiar with the work called the Dhammapada, it's a kind of anthology of discourses, of verses ascribed to the Buddha, arranged according to a number, about 24, 27 chapters. How many chapters? 27, I think. Yeah, it's about 400 something verses organized into 27 chapters. But the very first chapter is called the chapter of the pairs. And the first verses in this first chapter distinguish the unwholesome mind and the wholesome mind. The verse goes in Pali, Mano pubhanga ma dhamma, mano seta, mano maya, manasacha badutena, basati va karoti va, tatonang dukam anveti, chakang va vahato padang.